I never wanted to be a field operative. I want to get that on record, right at the start, before anyone reads this account and concludes that I was the sort of man who went looking for trouble. I was not that man. I was, and remain, the sort of man who keeps his desk tidy, who takes his tea with 2 sugars, who genuinely believes that a well-organized filing system is the foundation of any successful organization. I had been perfectly content as a junior analyst in the intelligence directorate, cross-referencing satellite intercepts and writing summaries that nobody read. I had a small office. I had a window. I had a plant called Gerald. Gerald did not survive the war. Nothing much from that world survived the war, if I'm being precise about it. The office went first. The building was commandeered as a processing center in the 2nd month. The window I can't account for. Gerald I know about because I went back once in the 7th month when we had a rare 48 hours of quiet, and I found him on the windowsill exactly where I had left him, brown and dry and conclusively finished. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, and then I left, because there was nowhere to put the feeling, and because DW was waiting in the car, and there was always something else that needed doing. I think about Gerald sometimes still. It's the kind of thing that doesn't make sense to think about a plant amid everything else, but the mind goes where it goes. The Verdians made contact on a Tuesday, which I have always found darkly appropriate. Nobody expects the worst to happen on a Tuesday. Mondays carry a kind of bracing fatalism. You go in ready for something to be wrong. Fridays you're distracted, thinking about the weekend, running on fumes and good intentions. But Tuesday is the day you let your guard down. Tuesday is the day you think, well, the week has started decently enough. Perhaps things will be all right after all. They were not all right. The first contact came over every communication frequency simultaneously, a pulse so precisely coordinated that our analysts initially mistook it for a solar event. I know this because I was in the building when it happened, and I watched 3 of our senior scientists argue about coronal mass ejections for 40 minutes while the translation was already sitting in the system, waiting patiently. The Verdians had, it turned out, been studying our communications for 11 years before they announced themselves. They knew precisely how to phrase their arrival to produce the maximum administrative confusion. It was, I would later understand, a very Verdian thing to do, efficient, calculated, entirely lacking in what a human strategist might call mercy, though I don't think the concept maps onto their cognition in any useful way. Their message was brief. It said, translated from their pheromone pulse encoding into flat English, "We are the collective. We have been patient. We will not continue to be patient. Prepare your governance structures to receive our administration." That was it. No demands. No deadline. No list of grievances or catalog of sins. No attempt to negotiate or posture or perform the theater of threat that human conflicts invariably produce. Just the flat, biological certainty of a species that had never, in its entire evolutionary history, encountered a problem it could not solve by releasing the correct chemical signal to the correct receptors in the correct concentration. We were, as far as they were concerned, simply a logistical matter, a planet to be administered, a resource problem to be solved. I want you to understand that because it matters for everything that came afterwards. They did not hate us. They did not fear us. They had no particular feelings about us at all, any more than you have feelings about an administrative task that needs to be completed before end of business. We were on the list. They were working through the list. That was the full extent of their relationship with the human species in those first months, and the cold evenness of it was, in some ways, harder to deal with than aggression would have been. With aggression, you know where you stand. I met Agent White for the first time 6 days after contact. He came into my office without knocking, which should have told me everything I needed to know about the next 11 months. He was shorter than I expected. I'd heard the name. Everyone in the directorate had heard the name. The name had a kind of institutional mythology around it that I had always assumed was exaggerated. and he wore a white field suit that had seen better days, scuffed at the knees and the left elbow, with a small tear along the right lapel that he had not bothered to have repaired. He had the look of a man who had not slept properly in some time, but was not going to mention it, because mentioning it would be an acknowledgement that sleep was something he required, and he had apparently decided, at some point in his career, that acknowledging requirements was a form of vulnerability he was not going to practice. He looked at Gerald. He looked at my filing system, 3 years of careful color-coded organization, the best-maintained secondary analysis archive in the directorate. He looked at me. "You're Penfold," he said, "not a question." "I am," I said, "and you're?" "I've read your assessment of the Verdian communication protocols," he said, sitting down in my spare chair without being invited. He sat the way some people drive, with total confidence in the correctness of what he was doing. The section on chemical cognition, the argument that they don't experience individual fear because threat response in their species is collective and distributed across the hive network. That was good work. I said thank you and waited. "The problem," he said, "is that Colonel Kincaid has decided your work is too good to stay on paper." Colonel Kincaid was our commanding officer, a large, broad man with magnificent white whiskers and the administrative instincts of a medieval siege engineer. He knew how to bring force to bear on a problem, and he knew how to identify which problems were worth bringing force to bear on, and he had, in 30 years of intelligence work, built a directorate that functioned despite every effort of bureaucratic inertia to prevent it. I had enormous respect for him. I also had some experience of what it meant when Kincaid decided your work was too good to stay on paper, and that experience had been acquired through watching it happen to other analysts, from a comfortable distance, and thinking privately that I was glad it wasn't me. "What does that mean?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew. "It means," said Agent White, "that you're being reassigned, effective immediately. You'll be my secondary operative." He stood. "Pack light, we leave in 20 minutes. I looked at Gerald. Gerald looked back at me, in the way that plants do when they are being relied upon to provide moral support and lack the capacity to provide it. "I don't have any field training," I said. "I've had the basic certification course, the 1-week program. I believe I passed the written examination with some distinction, but the practical component there were some concerns raised about." "I know," he said from the doorway. He didn't seem troubled by this. "That's fine. You won't be doing the field parts." He was wrong about that, as it turned out. But then, we were wrong about a great many things in those early weeks. That was rather the nature of the situation. The Verdians had established what they called processing stations in 7 locations across the British Isles within the first month. We called them something considerably less polite around the operations room, and Kincaid called them a provocation, which was technically accurate but strategically incomplete. A provocation implies the provoker has some interest in your emotional response, and the Verdians had none. They set up their stations with the same energy they might apply to setting up a filing system, methodical, comprehensive, and entirely indifferent to how the files felt about being filed. They were efficient in a way that was genuinely difficult to watch. No drama, no cruelty for its own sake, just cold, methodical assessment of existing human infrastructure and a systematic program of adjusting it to their purposes. The roads they wanted, they used. The buildings they wanted, they converted. The supply chains they wanted interrupted, they interrupted, not through force but through the precise application of logistical pressure at the points their analysis had identified as critical. Their ground forces were called by our analysts the Verdian Collective Infantry. I called them the Greens, which was both descriptive. Their field carapaces were the color of old copper gone to verdigris, and pleasantly dismissive, which I needed for morale purposes. Their leading commander, a creature our intelligence files designated Senior Collective Coordinator Grenvash, had a face that I can only describe by saying that if you had never seen an amphibioid face before, This was not the one you would want as your introduction to the category. He was, by Verdian standards, apparently charismatic. By human standards, he looked like evolutionary proof that some experiments in consciousness should have been abandoned at the pond-dwelling stage and not permitted to develop planetary ambitions. He had a lieutenant we called Stilts because of the way he moved, long, angular, dark as a shadow, built in a way that suggested the universe had assembled him from leftover components that weren't quite right for any other project. Stilts never appeared in our intercepts except at Grenvash's side, and never communicated in any format our translators could reliably parse. He simply appeared, and then things went wrong, and then he disappeared again. After the third time we noticed the pattern, DW started building Stilt's presence into his operational planning as a variable called unscheduled complication, which I thought was both accurate and, in a very specific way, an understatement. The vehicle DW used for operations was a white reconnaissance car that he called the Mark III and that I referred to, privately and never aloud, as the machine that was going to be the end of me. It was, officially, a modified tactical transport. What it actually was, in the experiential sense, the sense that you feel in your stomach and the backs of your hands, was a white car that moved at speeds human vehicles have no business moving at, piloted by a man who had apparently made a private arrangement with the relevant physical laws to behave themselves whilst he was in charge. He drove with total calm. I gripped things. By the fourth month I had developed sufficient familiarity with the sensation of low-altitude, high-speed maneuvers to keep my eyes open and maintain the appearance of composure, which I considered a significant personal achievement, and which DW never commented on, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The first major operation was the breeding facility, and I want to be clear about what the breeding facility actually was, because the summaries written afterwards tend to soften it in a way that I don't think is honest. Grenvash's initial strategy for provisioning his occupation forces was resource acquisition from the target planet, which is standard Verdian procedure. You don't ship food across light years when the planet you're occupying has a functioning food chain. The analysis they'd done over 11 years of observation had identified several candidates, and they had settled on the domestic chicken as their primary protein source, which sounds, I am aware, faintly absurd. It was not absurd. The Verdians had introduced a biological augmentation agent, a pheromone-based growth stimulant, delivered through the feed supply, that accelerated the growth cycle by a factor our agricultural scientists described as implausible. And then, upon verifying their instruments twice and rechecking their methodology, described as catastrophic. The chickens that came out of the Grenvash breeding facility were not chickens in any sense that would be recognizable to anyone who kept chickens, or who had ever been near a chicken, or who had a general sense of what the word chicken implied about scale and temperament. They were 8 feet tall. They were structurally unstable in the way that anything is structurally unstable when you have applied a growth agent without attending sufficiently to the load-bearing mathematics. The legs in particular seemed to be making an ongoing series of regrettable decisions about how to support the body above them. And they were, due to an apparently unforeseen interaction between the pheromone stimulant and the baseline avian neurology, extremely, continuously, and comprehensively angry. The Verdians had not anticipated the anger. This was the first indication, though we didn't fully recognize it as such at the time, that biological systems do not always behave as projected. The collective's models were excellent for systems that operated within consistent parameters. The chickens had decided, at some deep neurological level, that consistent parameters were not for them. The anger was, in retrospect, very chicken. Chickens are angrier than people give them credit for. You scale that up to 8 feet, with a bone structure that's making unwise architectural choices, and the anger becomes a significant operational concern. DW and I went into the facility on the 14th day of the breeding program. The approach was by night, which was appropriate. The facility's external lighting was calibrated for Verdian visual spectrum, which skews toward the infrared, so the patches of the compound that looked well lit to their sentries looked dark to human eyes and vice versa. DW had mapped the blind spots using a combination of spectral analysis, and I suspect a certain amount of straightforward intuition that he would never have described in those terms. We went in through a ventilation access point. I want to address the ventilation access point directly, because it features in DW's operational summary as a standard infiltration approach. And this is a document in which I am committed to accuracy. And the accurate description of the ventilation access point is that it was a duct of dimensions suitable for someone approximately 2/3 of DW's mass, and perhaps half of mine. And navigating, it required a sustained and personal engagement with my own claustrophobia that I had not anticipated being part of my intelligence career. I will say this for DW, he never looked back to check on my progress. He moved ahead at a pace that implied the duct was perfectly adequate, and he did not comment on any of the sounds that followed behind him, and he did not acknowledge the brief pause at the second junction where I had to stop, breathe very deliberately, and remind myself of several facts. That the duct was finite, that the mission was important, and that if I went back now I would have to go back through the parts I'd already been through, which was not an improvement. He simply waited, without making a production of waiting, and when I reached him he moved on, and that was the full extent of what passed between us on the subject. Inside the facility, the smell was the first thing. It was the smell of accelerated biology growth happening faster than it was designed to happen, cells dividing at a rate that left a kind of hot, organic pressure on the air, like standing too close to something that is working harder than it should. Beneath that, the baseline agricultural smell of large numbers of birds in an enclosed space, which is not, under any circumstances, an improvement on anything. The control apparatus is in the central management hub, DW said, in the tone a person might use to identify items on a shopping list. Very calm, very specific, as though we were not standing in a dimly lit corridor with the rhythmic sounds of 8-foot chickens shifting their weight on the other side of a partition wall. The chickens, I said very carefully, are between us and the central management hub. Yes, he said. The very large chickens. They're in a quiescent feeding phase, he said. We have approximately 4 minutes before the next stimulant cycle. And what happens during the stimulant cycle? The feeding phase ends, he said. They become alert. How alert? He paused for just a fraction of a second. Significantly alert, he said. He was already moving. I followed, because the alternatives were to stay in the corridor alone, or to leave the way we'd come through the ventilation duct, and both of those options had problems that made following DW through a room full of enormous chickens seem, relatively speaking, the less alarming choice. This is the kind of calculation that becomes normal in field work, and I want to record for anyone reading this who has never done field work that normality in this context is not the same as comfort. It is simply the recalibration of what constitutes an acceptable level of distress. DW moved through the breeding facility with the ease of a man who has calculated every variable in advance and found them all within acceptable parameters. He located the control apparatus in under 90 seconds. He assessed the pheromone dispersal system, the mechanism the Verdians were using to deliver the stimulant cycle, and he spent perhaps 2 minutes looking at it with the particular focused attention that meant he was working out something that he would not explain to me until afterwards, because explaining it whilst working it out would slow him down. Then he reprogrammed it. I want to be specific about this, because it matters. He reprogrammed an alien biotech system, a pheromone dispersal array that had been designed by a species with 11 years of preparation, and 1 billion years of evolutionary precedent in chemical communication. By working backwards from the output behavior to the input logic, using a toolkit that he kept in his jacket pocket, and that contained items I would not have known the correct use for without a reference manual. He did this in under 3 minutes. The system was designed to run a stimulant cycle on schedule. He made it run, on schedule, the chemical signal the Verdians use to indicate that a resource batch has completed processing and is no longer required to be active. Which is to say, he told the chickens in their own biological language that they were done. The chickens, when the reversed cycle hit, stopped. They stood very still. 8 feet of angry, architecturally inadvisable chicken, and then the signal came, and the anger went out of them the way air goes out of a balloon when you let it down carefully, slowly, and then all at once. And then they sat, all of them, with the particular gravity of birds who have decided that the current situation does not require further engagement, and that sitting is now the correct choice. We were in the car, and clear of the facility perimeter, before the Verdian security team reached the control hub. That was effective, I said, when I had recovered the use of coherent speech. It was relatively straightforward, DW said. He was running an altitude adjustment that he considered routine, and that I considered a significant personal challenge. They didn't account for the possibility that the dispersal system could be operated in reverse. It's a Verdian cognitive limitation. They designed systems on the assumption that anyone who encounters them will operate within the parameters the systems were designed to accommodate. They don't imagine someone working backwards, I said. They don't need to in a collective, he said. The collective produces the system. The collective uses the system. No individual member would have cause to work backwards from the output, because the system was produced by the collective intelligence that the individual is part of. The assumption is that any agent is inside the same consensus reality as the designers. And we're not, I said. We've never been inside anyone's consensus reality but our own, he said, which has always been our primary liability, and which is increasingly looking like it might also be our primary asset. I thought about this for a long time in the days that followed. It turned out to be important. It turned out in the end to be the most important thing. The second major operation came from Kincaid himself, and it arrived with the particular energy of a man who has been sitting behind a desk watching things deteriorate, and has reached the limit of what his temperament will permit. Kincaid's message came by secure burst transmission, while DW was navigating the Mark III through airspace that I was choosing not to think about in specific terms. The colonel's face on the small display screen looked, as it had looked since the Verdians arrived, like a man who was holding a great deal of weight with no good options for putting it down. Grenvash had moved to the next phase. Phase 1 had been resource preparation, the chickens, and 3 other programs we hadn't fully mapped yet. Phase 2, according to every intelligence channel Kincaid's people could access, was infrastructure denial. The Verdians had identified maritime shipping as the critical vulnerability in human supply chains. The logic was clean. Interrupt enough shipping, and you don't need to fight. You just wait. Populations that can't feed themselves negotiate on whatever terms you offer. The mechanism was the part that was hardest to hear, because it was so well considered. The Verdians were seeding the major shipping lanes with enormous fabricated structures that appeared, to maritime radar, as natural ice formations. Ships were diverting. Some ships were diverting too late. The structures weren't just obstacles, they were a demonstration. A proof of concept delivered at scale that the collective could make the sea too difficult to use without ever engaging a single vessel directly. We found the fabrication facility on a small island that the Verdians had, with characteristic thoroughness, removed from the navigation charts before moving in. The facility was producing, on a continuous cycle, enormous block structures built from a Verdian composite material, crystalline, thermally stable at surface temperatures, with a radar signature indistinguishable from natural ice. The engineering was elegant. I say this with no pleasure. It was the work of a species that understood materials science at a level that made our best work look approximate. The fabrication process requires continuous power from their main energy relay, DW said, looking at the facility schematics with the calm focus that was either very reassuring or very alarming depending on how much thought I gave to what the calm focus was directed at. If you interrupt the relay, the material becomes thermally unstable. Unstable in what sense? It expands, he said. The crystalline structure loses coherence and the stored thermal energy disperses outward, rapidly. How rapidly? Rapidly enough that you don't want to be nearby, he said. But the process takes approximately 40 minutes to initiate after relay interruption, long enough to be clear. He had already calculated the garrison rotation, 3 days of patient analysis of movement patterns from satellite imagery. The VCI personnel rotated at the 40-minute mark by standard Verdian scheduling. Consistent, precise, the kind of regularity that, in a human institution, you'd call good discipline. In a Verdian operation, it was just the collective being the collective. Everything on schedule, because deviation from schedule required an individual decision, and the collective produced very few of those. The infiltration was the operation that frightened me most, and not for the reason you might expect. I had by this point 4 months of field experience. 4 months is not very much in absolute terms, but it is a significant amount of time to spend being regularly frightened, and I had developed, if not exactly courage, then a kind of worn-in familiarity with being frightened that made it less immediately incapacitating. I knew what my own fear felt like. I had, in a limited way, learned to continue doing the necessary things while experiencing it. What I was not prepared for was stilts. Stilts was not on the patrol rotation. Stilts did not appear in any of the scheduling data. Stilts moved according to some internal logic that our pattern analysis had not been able to model, and the reason our pattern analysis had not been able to model it, I later concluded, was that Stilts may have been operating with a degree of individual judgment unusual for a Verdian field operative. Whether this was a quirk of his biology or something Grenvash had specifically cultivated, I don't know. I only know that Stilts was in the secondary access corridor at the precise moment I was not supposed to encounter anyone, and that the moment I registered this fact, everything I had learned about managing fear under operational conditions became temporarily and comprehensively unavailable to me. Stilts was taller than I was by a considerable margin. He was armored in Verdian field carapace, the hardened biological shell they deploy for close-quarters operations, grown over the standard uniform and reinforced at the joints. It is not something you can damage with standard-issue human equipment. Stilts had reflexes calibrated over millions of years of competitive evolution in an environment where slowness was selection pressure. He was looking at me with the flat, evaluative attention of something that has not yet decided whether I constitute a threat or a nuisance. What happened next I have described in various operational debriefs with varying degrees of accuracy. The accurate description is this: I was completely, thoroughly, and inescapably terrified, in a way that bypassed every layer of professional conditioning I had spent 4 months developing, and my body, operating entirely without input from the reasoning parts of my mind, made a decision. It lunged sideways. Not toward Stilts. Not away from Stilts, which would have been strategically reasonable. Sideways, in a direction that had not been part of any plan, with an accompanying sound that I will not reproduce here, but which was not what you would describe as tactically useful. The direction I went was into the power relay junction housing. The power relay junction housing was not designed to withstand the impact of a panicking analyst moving at speed. Its shielding was designed to protect the relay components from Verdian environmental conditions, which are different from the conditions produced when a human being falls into something whilst making the sounds I was making. The relay disconnected. The housing sparked. The fabrication process began its 40-minute thermal instability countdown. Stilts looked at the relay. He looked at me. He looked at the relay again. He produced a pheromone emission that our translators later characterized as expressing extreme administrative displeasure at an unmodeled variable, and then he left. Because Stilts understood priorities, and the priority was evacuation. DW found me sitting on the floor of the corridor 90 seconds later. "You disconnected the relay," he said. "I fell into it," I said. He looked at the sparking housing. He looked at me. Something in his expression, not quite what you'd call amusement, because that wasn't a word I'd have applied to him, but something adjacent to it came and went. "The outcome," he said, helping me to my feet, "is the same. The outcome involved considerably more personal distress than your plan presumably anticipated," I said. "My plan," he said, and there was something dry and certain in his voice, "accounted for improvisation. We cleared the facility with 11 minutes to spare. The blocks in the shipping lanes, the false icebergs, already seeded across 3 major routes, went thermally unstable simultaneously. They cracked apart. They sank. The water absorbed what remained. The shipping lanes were navigable again within 6 hours, and Kincaid's voice on the secure channel when he called had in it something I hadn't heard since the first Tuesday. Something that sounded like a man who has glimpsed the possibility that things might, eventually, come right. "Well done, lads," he said. "Well done." It was a small thing to say. It meant rather a great deal in context. There had been, in the preceding months, very few moments that felt like genuine progress. Most of the work was attrition and disruption, the slow erosion of Verdian confidence in a campaign they had expected to be administrative. You don't feel victory in that kind of work. You feel the absence of defeat, which is different and which is much harder to sustain on. Kincaid's voice on that channel, with something lighter in it than there had been for weeks, was the first thing that felt, even briefly, like winning rather than simply not losing yet. DW acknowledged the transmission and closed the channel and flew south without comment. But I was always noticing things about DW by this point. It was half the job, that the next time he turned the car keys over in his hand, there was something slightly less weighted in the motion. I didn't mention it. We didn't discuss that kind of thing. But I noted it in the internal account I kept of the campaign, the one that wasn't in any official file. Now I have to write about the dream program, and I want to be careful about this, because it is the part of this account that reflects most directly on who DW is, and on what, exactly, I was willing to do about it when it mattered. By the 5th month of the campaign, Grenvash understood that his operation was not running to projections. The resource programs had been disrupted. The infrastructure denial strategy had been dismantled. The garrison scheduling that was supposed to be impenetrable had been read and worked around so consistently that the collective's forward command had reportedly opened a formal review of whether standard scheduling protocols constituted a vulnerability in environments with observed human opposition. The Verdians did not feel humiliation. They did not feel frustration in the neurological sense that humans do, but they were capable, at the collective level, of recognizing when their models were producing inadequate predictions, and Grenvash was capable, in a way that I would later come to understand was unusual for a Verdian commander, of recognizing that the specific gap in every model was the same: Agent DW. The dream program was what Grenvash built in response. Our scientists described it afterwards as a targeted neurological decohesion system. I will try to translate that into plain language, because I think it matters that anyone reading this understands what it was, not just what it was called. The device broadcast a signal tuned to the specific neurological architecture responsible for integrated cognition, for the process by which the brain continuously cross-references incoming sensory data against existing knowledge and produces a coherent model of what is currently true. Disrupt that cross-referencing process, and the brain continues to function. It continues to receive information. It continues to generate interpretations. It simply loses its ability to reliably tell the difference between the information coming from outside and the information it is generating from inside. A waking dream, permanent, targeted, with no clear edge between what is real and what is not. Grenvash aimed it at DW. The targeting required biometric data, a neurological signature, precise enough to calibrate the signal. The Verdians had planted sensors around our operating base over the preceding weeks, disguised as part of the facility infrastructure, and I had not found them until the program was already running. That is a failure I have not made peace with. I don't know that I will. I noticed the program's effects on the third day. Not obviously. Not in the way you notice when something has gone badly wrong. In the way you notice, when you know someone well, that something is slightly different, a fraction of a second's uncertainty where there was none before, a moment where the eyes track something that isn't there, a sentence that pauses, once in the middle, and then resumes. Nothing that would be visible to anyone who hadn't spent 5 months watching DW operate under conditions that would have finished most people before lunchtime. I knew him well enough by then. I did not tell him I had noticed. This was a choice, and I want to be clear that it was a deliberate one. DW was the operational center of everything we were doing. He was the reason our operations succeeded at the rate they did, and I knew, with the certainty of someone who had sat next to him, through enough operations to understand how his mind worked, that if he knew he was being affected, he would spend cognitive resources managing his own responses rather than solving the problem. He needed to believe he was functional right up until the moment the problem was solved. So I went to find the machine instead. I found it through signal triangulation, which is an analytical skill I had spent 3 years developing in a small office with a window, and which I had never expected to apply in the field. The DREAM program's transmission array put out a secondary radiation signature, a narrowband emission associated with the calibration cycle, that our portable equipment could read, if you knew what frequency to look for, and if you had done the mathematics to work out what pattern would indicate a targeted neurological broadcast rather than background interference. The array was on the roof of a Verdian administrative complex. It was guarded. I spent 2 days watching the guard rotation, which by that point in the campaign I was capable of reading by instinct, not because I had become tactically brilliant, but because I had spent 5 months watching Verdian guard rotations, and they were, without exception, consistent, because deviation required individual judgment, and individual judgment was not what the collective produced. I found the sensors first. 14 of them distributed around our base at irregular intervals, irregular enough that it had taken 2 days to map all of them. I removed them one at a time, in the gaps between rotations, over the course of those same 2 days. I did not tell DW what I was doing, because telling him would have required explaining why, and explaining why would have required acknowledging what I had noticed, and I had decided that acknowledging what I had noticed was not yet something I was willing to do. I want to be precise about what those 2 days were. They were the longest 2 days of the campaign for me, longer in their way than the fabrication facility infiltration, and longer than the ventilation duct. Because the fear involved was of a different and more wearing kind. I was afraid of being wrong, of having misread the signs, of having attributed to the DREAM program what was simply fatigue, and of having gone to considerable personal risk and disruption to solve a problem that hadn't existed. I was also afraid of being right, and of not having moved quickly enough. Both fears ran simultaneously, which is efficient in terms of occupying mental space, but not in terms of producing a calm operative. I kept moving. That is the only thing I know how to commend about my conduct in those 2 days. I was afraid and uncertain, and working from analysis and intuition in roughly equal parts, and I kept moving. When all 14 sensors were gone, I went to the roof array. What I did there, I will describe only in general terms, Because the specific technical details involve reverse engineering Verdian biotech that I do not have the credentials to explain properly. And because the honest truth is that I was working from memory and intuition more than knowledge. I had watched DW work backwards through alien systems enough times to have absorbed, at some level below articulation, the underlying principle. Find the thing the system assumes will remain constant, and change it. The dream program assumed it had current neurological targeting data. I locked the calibration cycle onto the data from the sensors. I had removed data that was now 12 hours old and getting staler by the minute. And I sealed the calibration input so the cycle would keep running on that stale data rather than refreshing from active sensors that no longer existed. A signal perfectly calibrated to someone's neurological signature, run on data that no longer corresponds to the current state of that person's neurology, produces an output that finds no target. It disperses. It dissipates. It is, from the program's perspective, a letter sent to an address that has changed. I got back to our operations room at 4 in the morning. I sat at my analysis desk and I did not sleep, because sleep seemed, under the circumstances, like something I had not earned. DW came in at 7. He stood at the situation display, which was showing the Verdian logistics network in the northern regions, and I watched, carefully, quietly, without appearing to watch, for the pause. It came once, a fraction of a second, and then it was gone and it did not come again. He looked at the display for another 30 seconds. Then he looked at me. "You've been doing something," he said. "Analytical work," I said. "Secondary operative support." He held my eyes for a moment that was longer than professional assessment required. I kept my expression neutral, which was the hardest thing I had done in 6 months of increasingly hard things. "Right," he said and looked back at the display. "Grenvash is moving. He's relocating his command structure north. We need to be ahead of him." "How far north?" "Scotland," he said. "Mountains. He thinks the terrain will work in his favor." He picked up the car keys. He turned them over once in his hand, the habit I'd noticed in the first week and never mentioned. "He'll have stilts with him," he said. "I assumed so," I said. "We'll need to be careful." "We're always careful," I said. Something in his expression, brief, controlled but there, suggested that this was not quite how he would have characterized our operational approach. Then he was already moving, and I was already following, and that was how it always went. The final operation is the one I find hardest to write about, not because it was the worst. The fabrication facility infiltration was, in terms of personal distress experienced, probably worse. But because it is the one where I most clearly understand, looking back, what happened and why it worked and what it says about us. The Mountain Research Station had been, before the occupation, a government climate monitoring facility. Grenvash had chosen it as his mobile command center for reasons that were, from a Verdian strategic perspective, sound. It was remote. The terrain was genuinely difficult by the standards of mechanized approach. The facility had been built to be self-contained, so the supply chain was minimal and the vulnerabilities were few. And it was the kind of location that Verdian strategic analysis, which was very good, very thorough, and built on 11 years of observation, would identify as difficult for a human force to reach quickly and more difficult to assault effectively. There was just one thing Grenvash hadn't fully accounted for. The Mark III. The Mark III did not care about terrain in the way that ground vehicles care about terrain. The Mark III cared about physics, and it had a relationship with physics that I did not fully understand and had given up trying to, because DW's explanations of the propulsion system had consistently used terminology that implied a background in engineering that I did not possess and was not going to acquire under operational conditions. We flew north. The mountains below were gray and enormous and completely indifferent to the situation, the way mountains are. I looked at them and thought about Gerald, because my mind goes sideways when I'm tense, and about the filing system, and about the 11 months, and about all the operations between the first Tuesday and this one. Grenvash has been running an individual campaign, I said. He has, DW said. The collective standard model doesn't produce individual campaigns, I said. They pool analysis. They distribute cognition. A Verdian commander who's been developing individual strategic adaptations is outside the standard parameters. He's been running a campaign that keeps failing in ways the collective can't explain, DW said. That stress does something, even to a Verdian. It's made him personal about it, I said. He's thinking about you specifically. He's been designing systems with you in mind. Yes. So everything in that facility will be designed around what you do, I said. The vulnerabilities will be where he thinks you'll look for them. The systems will have contingencies for the approaches he's seen you use. He knows your methods because he's been on the losing end of them for 11 months. Which means, DW said, very level, that operating in my usual way is playing into his model. Yes, I said, and what breaks a model is something that doesn't fit it. The mountains came and went below us. The evacuation protocol, DW said after a long pause. Tell me. Verdian command positions require chemical authorization from the commanding officer to trigger an evacuation. If Grenvash triggers it personally, the command structure withdraws and the automated systems take over. The automated systems run standard collective parameters without his individual adaptations. He paused, which we can model. So we need him to trigger it voluntarily, I said. We need to do something that he doesn't have a prepared counter for, something outside the model he's built around your methods. Something that doesn't look like a tactic, DW said. Something that looks like a mistake, or like arrogance, or like something no one has ever done because no one would do it. I thought about it for what was probably 30 seconds, but felt considerably longer. We walk in the front door, I said. DW was quiet for the full count of 7. Then, yes. We land in full visibility. We walk up to the main approach. We stand there and we wait. And Grenvash, DW said, will receive a sensor report telling him that the agents who have been dismantling his operation for 11 months are at his front door making no attempt at concealment. And he will not have a prepared response, because no prepared response exists for that situation, because no rational operational planner would include it in a model of expected human behavior. Because it's irrational, I said. Because it's irrational, he agreed. And the only thing a commander can do when his model has no applicable category is fall back on the one response the collective always has for a situation it can't classify. Evacuation and reassessment, I said. Evacuation and reassessment, he said. He landed the Mark III at the main approach to the command station, not the concealed approach, not the service entry, not the secondary access point. The main approach, in full sensor visibility, on a flat piece of ground that the facility sensors swept on every rotation. He got out. I got out. We walked up to the primary access point. We stood there. I don't know precisely what I looked like, standing there on a Scottish hillside at the main entrance to an alien command facility in the early morning. I know what I felt like, which was very cold and more afraid than the situation technically required, and also, underneath all of that, in a way I hadn't expected, something else. Something that I can only describe as absolute bloody-mindedness. The specific human quality that says, we are doing this thing. There is no version of the next 5 minutes in which we are not doing this thing. Whatever happens, we are doing it. The sensor report reached Grenvash in the first 10 seconds. I estimated it from the change in the facility's sound profile, the particular harmonic shift of a Verdian operation going to alert status. 10 seconds for the sensors to compile and transmit. Perhaps 15 for Grenvash to receive and read. and then 40 seconds of quiet, which was the time it took the most individually adapted Verdian commander in the occupation to look at a sensor report he had no framework for, and reach the only conclusion available when a model fails completely. The evacuation protocol triggered. The facility went to automated systems. The automated systems ran standard collective parameters. Standard collective parameters after 11 months were parameters we knew. Stilts came out first, in the vanguard of the evacuation column, long and dark and moving with that angular efficiency. He looked at us as the column passed, and I looked back, and I think that in that moment I understood why Grenvash had kept him close. Stilts was the closest thing the Verdian occupation had to an operational improviser. He would have known, in his way, what we were doing. He would have understood that something was off about the picture. But he was under evacuation protocol, and evacuation protocol was protocol, and in the collective, protocol supersedes individual judgment. He looked at us for one full second, then he moved on. Grenvash came out near the end of the column. He was smaller in person than I had expected. Authority reads differently across species. He was moving with the precise, unhurried pace of Verdian protocol, the chemical signals of command and withdrawal flowing around him like something invisible but felt. He was flanked by his administrative cadre, 2 data archivists, and 3 security personnel. And he looked back. He shouldn't have. Verdian evacuation protocol does not include a step for looking back. But he did. He turned at the edge of the transport ramp, and he looked at us, DW standing there with his hands at his sides and me standing next to him, both of us slightly wind-blown and probably, from a Verdian perspective, extremely difficult to parse, and he held that look for what was probably 3 seconds. I could not read his face. The biology was too different, but I thought, for just a moment, that I understood something about what he was experiencing, even across all that evolutionary distance. The particular feeling of having run a very good campaign against an adversary you've studied carefully, and having the adversary turn out in the end to be something your study didn't fully capture. The transport sealed. The evacuation column lifted. DW watched it go. The automated systems will run for 72 hours before requiring chemical authorization they can't provide remotely, he said. After that, the command structure in this region defaults to standby. And the other regions. Kincaid's teams are ready. They've been waiting for the evacuation protocol exploit to be proven viable. He paused. This proves it viable. The mountain was very quiet and very gray, and the morning light was coming in at a low angle over the ridgeline. Somewhere in the middle distance, there was a bird, a real one, the 8-foot kind, doing what birds do, indifferent to the occupation and to the liberation alike. It's over, I said. He was quiet for a moment that I let stretch. This part is over, he said. There'll be negotiations. The collective calls it a resource assessment pause. We'll call it a ceasefire and then a withdrawal and then something else. But they'll go. They'll go, he said. They came here expecting a logistical problem, something to be administered. He turned the car keys over once in his hand. What did they find instead? I asked, though I thought I knew. He looked at the empty hillside where the command station had been, and at the mountains, and at the gray Scottish sky. Something they couldn't administer, he said. We drove back south. He drove because he always drove, and I sat with my portable screen on my knee and the analysis files open and did not look at any of them. I watched the landscape go past, and I thought about the 11 months and everything in them, all of it compressed into something I didn't yet have words for, the way experiences are before time processes them into stories. The Verdians had planned it very carefully. 11 years of study before they announced themselves. Comprehensive analysis of our infrastructure, our psychology, our military capability, our resource chains, our communication protocols. They had produced what was, by all accounts, including the accounts of our own scientists, who studied the planning documents after the withdrawal, an extremely thorough model of the human species and its expected responses to occupation. And then we had been irrational at them, repeatedly, until they left. I think about that sometimes, even now. I think about what they got wrong, and I keep coming back to the same thing. It wasn't the resource calculations or the infrastructure mapping or the garrison scheduling or any of the operational specifics. Those were all good work. The Verdians were not careless or arrogant. They were thorough. What they got wrong was the thing at the bottom of it. The thing underneath all the modeling and the analysis and the projected response curves. The thing they had no category for, because their billion years of distributed hive intelligence had never had occasion to develop one. They could model intelligence. They could model strategy. They could model in the abstract that individual organisms could be unpredictable within certain ranges. What they could not model was what happens when a species that has evolved under conditions of scarcity and competition and loss decides. Not strategically, not optimally, not for any reason that a good model would predict, that it is simply not going to accept the outcome. They couldn't model spite, not really, not the specific, human, slightly irrational quality of spite that says, no, not because no is the strategically correct answer, not because the available resources support no, not because any reasonable calculus produces no. Just because something in the blood and the bone and the accumulated stubbornness of a species that has been arguing with its environment since it first had the cognitive capacity to argue says no, and means it, and keeps meaning it past any sensible point. They couldn't model a man falling into a power relay junction and knocking out a system he had no business knocking out, and that fall saving 6 shipping lanes. They couldn't model someone spending 2 days quietly removing 14 sensors without telling the person he was protecting, because that person needed to believe the problem was manageable right up until the moment it was managed. They couldn't model 2 people standing at the front door of an alien command facility in full visibility, not because it was the optimal tactical approach, but because it was the one thing nobody would do, and so it was the one thing nobody had a response for. They came here with a planet to administer. They found us instead. The negotiations ran 4 months. The collective called it a resource assessment pause. We called it a ceasefire and then a withdrawal, and then, when Kincaid made his formal address, a victory, which is the word we use for the version of events we can bear to look at properly. Kincaid, at the ceremony I did not attend because I was in a small temporary office writing the mission reports that had accumulated over 11 months of sustained non-filing, called it a triumph of the human spirit. I heard the speech later, in transcript. When I told DW what Kincaid had said, he looked at the situation for a moment with the expression he used when something was approximately but not quite right. I'd call it a triumph of not doing what they expected, he said. Same thing, I said. He considered this seriously, because he considered most things seriously. Perhaps, he said, perhaps it is. I got a new office, slightly larger, different window which faces east rather than north, which is an improvement in winter. I went back to writing summaries, and the summaries were read now, because the people reading them had learned in the hardest way available that the things analysts say about alien cognition are worth attending to before the aliens arrive rather than after. DW went on to other operations. That is the nature of the work. You are present for one part of it, and then the situation moves and you move with it, and the next person is present for the next part. There is no continuity except what you carry in yourself. I got a new plant. I haven't named it yet. I'm thinking about it. But sometimes I stand at my east-facing window in the early morning, with the tea that I still take with 2 sugars, and I think about the Scottish hillside and the evacuation column and the moment Grenvash looked back. And I think about what it meant, that he looked back. Whatever the biology, whatever the cognitive architecture, Whatever the million evolutionary miles between his species and mine, he looked back, and I think he was trying to understand something. Trying to fit us into a category that would make the outcome make sense. I don't know if he ever found one. I know that we don't fit neatly into categories. We never have. We are, as a species, specifically and stubbornly resistant to being filed correctly, which has been the source of a great deal of our historical trouble, and which is, it turns out, also the source of a great deal of our historical persistence. We're still here. That's not nothing. In the arithmetic of the universe, with its thousand-year civilizations and its billion-year evolutionary experiments and its cold, indifferent logic, it is perhaps not very much, but it is ours, and we earned it in the specific, irrational, thoroughly human way that we earn things, which is to say, by refusing to accept that we hadn't. I don't expect the Verdians to come back soon. I don't expect them to stay away forever either. We're on their list. They're thorough. But they'll update the model first. They'll spend years on it, I should imagine, working out what went wrong, cataloging the anomalies, trying to find the category that fits what we did to them, trying to understand spite and stubbornness and the specific human quality that makes a frightened man fall into a power relay and change the outcome of a battle by accident. Good luck to them. We've been trying to understand it ourselves for rather longer, and we haven't managed it yet. It's possible that's the point. We're still here.